The fires in Heorot had gone cold. Not for a single night, not for a week, not even for a season. For 12 long winters, the greatest hall in the north stood empty after the sun went down. That is the measure of the fear that settled over the Spear Danes. It began with one night of slaughter, 30 men taken in the dark, then another night, then another. At first, the survivors believed they could endure. They cleaned the blood from the floorboards. They buried the dead with the honor due to warriors. They lit the fires again and sat on the benches with weapons close at hand, telling themselves that courage would be enough. It was not enough. Grendel returned whenever he chose. Sometimes days passed between the attacks. Sometimes he came on consecutive nights. There was no pattern a man could learn and prepare for. There was only the certainty that the darkness outside the doors belonged to him. Before many seasons had passed, the warriors of Hrothgar stopped sleeping inside the hall. They would gather during the day. They would feast while the light lasted. They would listen to the poets and receive gifts from their king. But when the sky began to darken, they left. They barred the great doors from the outside. They walked back to their own homes or to smaller shelters where the walls felt closer and the night felt less absolute. Heorot, the hall raised for joy, became a place of daylight only. Hrothgar felt every empty night like a wound that would not close. He had built the hall as a gift to his people, a place where the victories of the day could be celebrated, where loyalty could be rewarded, where the kingdom could feel whole. Now the high seat sat in silence after sunset. The long tables waited unused. The carved pillars stood in shadow. The roof that had once held the sound of music and laughter held only the quiet of an abandoned place. A king is meant to protect his people. Hrothgar had done that on battlefields and in councils. He had driven enemies back and bound allies with gold and word. But against the thing that came from the marshes, every strength he possessed seemed useless. Year after year, he watched the same pattern repeat. A quiet evening, a sudden cry in the dark, morning light revealing what had been taken. Sometimes the tracks led toward the fenlands and then vanished into black water or heavy fog. Sometimes there were no tracks at all, only the absence of the men who should have been there. The grief of the survivors was private and public at once. Wives and mothers and fathers carried it in their faces. The warriors who remained carried it in the way they gripped their spears a little tighter when the light began to fade. Attempts were made. Young men full of pride rode out with torches and sworn companions. They searched the black water and the mist-hung ground. Some returned with nothing but exhaustion and stories of shapes that moved just beyond the reach of the light. Others did not return at all. Counselors spoke of strategies. Priests spoke of older powers and offered rights against the creature. Men of strength offered their own lives in the hope that one decisive stand might end the terror. Nothing succeeded. Grendel was not a raider who could be bargained with or driven off by numbers. He was something that hated the very sound of human gathering. The music, the laughter, the warmth of the hall, all of it seemed to call him from the dark places beyond the farms and the roads. And so the gathering stopped after dark. The years lengthened. 1 winter became 2, 2 became 5, 5 became 10, and still the shadow remained. Children who had been infants when the first attack came grew into young warriors who had never known a night when Heorot was safe. They learned the stories as part of the air they breathed. The empty hall was simply the way of the world. Older men remembered the early days of celebration and felt the loss more sharply. They spoke less of those nights. The memory had become too heavy to carry in open speech. Hrothgar himself grew older under the weight of it. His hair greyed, his strength remained, but the light in his eyes when he looked toward the hall at evening had changed. He still ruled with fairness. He still gave gifts. He still held the loyalty of his people. But the knowledge that his greatest creation had been taken from him lived in every decision, every quiet moment, every glance at the darkening sky. 12 winters of an empty hall. 12 winters of a king's quiet, relentless grief. The story of that grief did not stay inside of the borders of Denmark. Travellers came and went, merchants with goods from distant shores, sailors who had crossed open water, messengers carrying news between kingdoms, exiles seeking new lands. They saw the hall standing magnificent by day and abandoned by night. They heard the accounts from those who had survived the attacks. They carried the tale with them when they left. Along the roads and across the sea, the name of Grendel began to travel. Men in distant halls spoke of the great king whose roof was no longer his own. They spoke of the creature that came from the mist and left only silence behind. They spoke of 12 years of fear that no sword had been able to end. The story grew with each telling. Some details changed in the mouths of those who passed it on. The core remained the same. There was a hall of unmatched beauty. There was a king of proven strength. And there was a darkness that neither beauty nor strength could drive away. In the long nights of those years, Hrothgar never stopped being a king. He never stopped hoping that somehow the terror would lift, that some power greater than the one he possessed would arrive, that the benches would fill again after sunset, that the high seat would once more look out over a hall filled with living voices instead of memory. But hope carried alone for 12 winters is a heavy burden. The empty hall waited. The cold benches waited, the high seat waited, and beyond the doors, in the marshes and the fog, the darkness waited with them. That is the measure of the fear that held the Spear Danes. That is the shadow that fell across Heorot and did not lift. And that is the story that began to move farther than any man in Denmark could have foreseen. Far across the water, in the land of the Geats, the tale was about to find ears that would not turn away from it. But the long winters of fear still held the north, and the empty hall still stood under the cold stars, waiting for a dawn that had not yet come.